Okay, this PowerPoint focuses on ecological succession, the predictable sequence of change in plant community composition over time, and what we call dynamic equilibrium, that even if a system's stable at the carrying capacity, there's still fluctuation that can occur. And we'll look at human influences on succession and the way succession varies in different ecosystems. So it's the predictable sequence of ecosystem maturation, focusing on plants. Now, if you've been to the Virginia Wesleyan campus, you know there's a big wooded area in the back of that system. I want you to imagine, what if the backwoods of campus were destroyed by a fire, part of it or something like that. And then you went back to that area 1 year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years, 100 years later. How would that area change over time? You might expect some sort of predictable sequence of plants within that area, such as grasses, shrubs, fast-growing trees, and then slow-growing trees. So over time, the system will recover from the fire. Likewise, if you have an area where new rocks are created, like a volcanic eruption or a glacier scraping something down all the way to bedrock, how would that area change over time? You might expect the same sort of things, but you have to take a while for the soil to build itself up and grow. So mosses, lichen, breaking down the rocks into soil, then a longer period of grasses, then a period of shrubs, then a period of fast-growing trees, and maybe 250 years later, you might end up with a complex, what we call a climax forest. The sequence usually works this way, and that's called primary succession if you have to build rock at the start. This takes a lot longer. So going from exposed rocks to lichens and mosses, then to grasses, weeds, herbs, shrubs can make their way in, young forest, fast-growing trees like tulip poplar, and then you might shift between different types of mature forests, white oak and hickory. That could be taken over by beech trees, sugar maples, things like that. We call it a climax forest, but really it's still dynamic even within that one. So primary succession starts with just bare rock, no soil. Secondary succession is recovery from a disturbance like a fire or abandoning a farmed field. The weeds will come in, then the perennial weeds and grasses, then the shrubs, then fast-growing trees like pine trees, making a young forest. Then a mature forest would then be more deciduous plants probably, or a mix of pines and deciduous trees comprising the mature forest. This is secondary succession because it's recovery from a disturbance. It's not the first time that succession has occurred. That would be primary succession, but it's a recovery from a disturbance, setting it back. So primary succession starts with bare rock, no soil, no previous plants, takes longer, maybe 250 to 500 years to get through the whole sequence. Secondary succession follows a disturbance, fire, farming, both follow the same sequence of plants, but you might get to a mature forest in 80 or 100 years in secondary succession. There are some factors that can influence this, like how deep the soil is. In this particular example from your textbook, grasses are the first step, shrubs are the second. In areas that have shallow soil, it'll develop into a pine forest. In contrast, if the soil is deep and well developed, then an oak forest can develop, and then from that, a shii and kashi forest developing over time. So two different potential outcomes depending on the depth of the soil. In intertidal marine systems, rocky intertidal areas, if you have an area that's scraped clean, like let's say that a big massive driftwood log scrapes the barnacles clean and comes and bashes everything off of the rock. Now you just have, or a big rock hits and it breaks a rock open, and now you have a new bare rock patch. Several things can come. On the left-hand side, if bacteria or algae get there first and it's big enough, then the bacteria would develop on that surface. If it's small enough, the adult mussels can move into the space. The mussels are attached to the surface of the rock using some threads called byssal threads. These are kind of proteinaceous, and they can actually break some of them and lay down new ones so they can slowly move across the rock to take up that space. From the bacterial and algal film, seaweeds could make their way in there and outcompete the algae, or barnacles, if they get there first. Barnacles could take over that spot. It's kind of a first come, first serve, whichever larvae are floating by in the plankton at that moment and can take advantage of it. Now we're shifting down a little bit in this diagram. From the barnacles, if sea stars are present, you can have a mix of different organisms. The sea stars will take out some of the mussels and promoting a healthy mix like we saw in the Bob Payne study. If there's no sea stars, ultimately the mussels are going to encroach and take over, and you end up with a climax community of all mussels. On the left-hand side, if you start off with this algal film, and then limpets tend to settle in that area. This is a flat snail that's very wave resistant. They actually will, in very slow motion, they'll graze on the algae and they'll butt into the byssal threads of the mussels, keeping them at bay and basically kind of cultivating this grazing landscape. If the limpets come in, the limpets will take over and nobody else is getting in. And that can be an alternative option for this area. So that's how succession works in a different ecosystem, marine, rocky, intertidal. In marine sandy areas and tropical areas, mangroves are the trees that will establish themselves. This is further south than salt marshes. This is a species called red mangrove, and it has prop roots and it spreads them out within that area. It's also what we know as viviparous. It gives birth to live young. So the live-bearing fish are called viviparous. This one, basically the seed sprouts while it's still attached to the parent tree. So it's like the mother tree has given birth to the seedling. The seedling then either lands in the water, splashes, and goes and it floats to another habitat, or if it's low tide, it'll actually plant itself in the shade of the parent tree. From there, over time, because of the prop roots, sand and sediment will collect, organic material will collect, and you start to build up an island. If the island builds up enough, then the black mangrove comes in and can take over. It can't live in the salty water, but it can live a little further up. As you see, there's a little bit, it looks like little sticks sticking up out of the sand around this. Those are things called pneumatophores, which are extensions from the roots that enable it to live in low oxygen environments, such as you would find on these types of newly built islands. And then from there, the process continues to build up the soil, and it makes way for subsequent species. At low tide areas, you'd have the red mangrove, and intertidal areas. It shows the seedlings sprouting, and then they put down air roots and prop roots to stabilize themselves to gather more sediment, so much that the black mangrove can make its way in with its pneumatophores. And then from there, if the land builds up more, you can end up with white mangrove, buttonwood, or other plants like palm trees and things like that. So the further you get to the right of this graph, the more further along you are in the succession process in tropical sandy islands. Ponds and lakes basically fill in over time, ultimately becoming terrestrial. They start off oligotrophic, which we said means unproductive. Over time, nutrients wash in from the watershed, making them more productive, or mesotrophic. And then that continues to happen, and they can become eutrophic, very productive. The pond will fill in. There can be underwater plants covering the whole thing. It can end up as a marsh or a bog. And then ultimately, over a long time, it'll become terrestrial. During that time period, the amount of productivity of the system is going to change. So it starts off, productivity is on the y-axis, time is on the x-axis. It starts off oligotrophic, becomes very productive, levels off at a eutrophic system. Then when it starts to fill in as a bog, in this case, it goes senescent, and it decreases in production because the sphagnum has high acidity. and that makes it relatively inactive. The bog then develops into a bog forest where trees like tamaracks can make their way into the bog forest, and then it continues to fill in and develop, and you ultimately end up with a climax forest for that particular latitude. Humans can have impact on that. This is a Javanese polycultural field. They would do slash and burn agriculture, plant some of the crops, but then other ones would establish themselves. Bamboo can kind of take over, and some of the dominant trees will ultimately take over. And so it shifts from these different forest types, Kaboon to Kampusan to Talun, over time. And so then once they get done, they'll abandon the field, and then they'll pick a new area to slash and burn. So humans kind of reset the successional stage to these early successional stages. There's also what we call a dynamic steady state. Even something that reaches kind of a equilibrium, it's an equilibrium based on inputs and outputs. The gains and the losses are in balance. An individual of a stable size is a balance between the food inputs and the wastes. And it remains relatively stable in size after it's done growing. Births to the population represent immigration. Deaths and emigration take things out of the population. So the population remains roughly stable. It'll fluctuate within a range, but roughly stable around the carrying capacity. This also applies at different levels of ecological organization, like the community can change how many species are there as a new species colonizes and adds to the diversity of that area. Likewise, if a species goes extinct, then that decreases the amount of species within the community. For an ecosystem, solar energy, matter coming into the ecosystem, those are inputs. Energy and matter leaving the inputs, leaving the system are outputs. Keeping the system at relatively stable at a process we call dynamic equilibrium. And even on the whole scale of the biosphere, we have solar inputs and then energy passed back into space. So this gives us dynamic equilibrium. It's a balance between biotic capacity, the capacity of life to increase itself during favorable conditions, and environmental resistance, the capacity of the environment to limit the population around the carrying capacity. So it's going to fluctuate. It's not just static at that carrying capacity. Even a system, a climax forest, it's going to have trees fall, and then it's going to have new trees sprout and things like that. So it fluctuates around the carrying capacity. Predator-prey oscillations are a good example of this. In a past chapter, we talked about the fluctuations of snowshoe hare and lynx. Hare is the prey, lynx is the predator. The prey peaks slightly before the lynx. But you can see it's within a range, and it's going to cycle over time. Desertification is humans impacting succession. If they bring in animals to graze on the grasses, they're going to selectively remove the nutritious grasses and not the spiny, thorny, unnutritious grasses. So this can shift the desert. If you have excessive amounts of grazing, it gets rid of all the nutritious ones, and then it can potentially shift it to desert, modifying the soil. Humans can impact this through agriculture, through urban ecosystems, overexploitation of a resource, or causing a loss of natural function can get it out of that ideal range and into a different ecosystem stable state. Humans can impact this by suppressing fires. We have this idea of Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires, and that stopping forest fires is good. Well, it mostly is, but ecosystems evolved with fire as an important component, that it resets the nutrients back into the soil and gets rid of the extra litter layer. If you completely protect an area from fire, it can build up the amount of litter, and then when a fire happens, it's a major, major blaze. And so there can actually be more harm from fire suppression. The Kirtland's warbler is a plant or a warbler bird that relies on a plant, the jack pine, that's between 5 years old and 20 years old. So A fire resets the successional stage, brings it back to grasses, herbs, shrubs. After that phase, then the jack pines will invade, and it can only use the trees for nesting in if they're between 5 years old and 20 years old. Less than 5, too small. Predators could get at the nest. Bigger than that, and it prefers not to have those habitats. So it's not going to nest in mature forest. It likes more open, young forest. And so the conservation of Kirkland's warbler has required clear cuts and controlled blazes to reset succession in a series of plots and allow these plots to rotate in their age to always have some ideal habitat. So the Kirkland's warbler was on the endangered species list with something like 200 breeding pairs. That's it. Now it's up to like 2,000 breeding pairs. So it's dramatically recovered, but it's restricted to the jack pine forests of Michigan, pretty much. The red cockaded woodpecker is a species that ranges from Texas to Virginia. It likes open longleaf pine forests. Longleaf pine is relatively fire resistant. You can see the bases of these trees in the middle picture have been burned, but that's just a fire that returns the nutrients back from the undergrowth and prevents too many trees from establishing themselves. So the woodpecker likes it because it can fly from one tree to another. It has a good view of its territory. The one on the right cannot sustain red cockaded woodpeckers because fire has been suppressed, and so it has dense undergrowth, and that can impact the woodpecker's access to the foods. Likewise, if you were to light fire in that, it could potentially cause a massive blaze that then destroys everything. If you have time, copy these links into your browser, and you can check out some examples of some controlled burns in North Alabama. This guy in the Native Habitat Project does a series of videos that talks about them. When I was in grad school, I had a chance to participate in a controlled burn of a prairie. They would mow a strip around the edge as like a fire break and then light fire to one. We would stand at the edge with these giant, it's like a shovel handle, but at the end it had a long strip of rubber that was about 1 foot wide and about 2 feet long. And the idea was if the fire got out of control, you whap it with the fly swatter, the fire swatter, and put the fire out. We just kind of stood back and watched the area burn. It was just absolutely dramatic. But this gets rid of trees that are invading and trying to establish themselves and reset succession to the grasslands that have been basically over converted into agricultural areas. So if you get a chance, watch these two videos. Slash and burn agriculture often includes burning, hence the name. It's also known as swidden agriculture. So they'll cut down the trees, they'll burn them. It converts it to an open sunlit space where it's ideal for agriculture. But then over time, it will get weeds, undergo transition, convert back to a native forest. This can then be abandoned and in favor of the mature forest, and then they'll clear a new area to start off. We talked about this with agroforestry in Java. All right, you might think about, have there been any examples in your area where humans have impacted that predictable change in the region, suppressing fires or something else? What were some of the human activities that made them happen, and could you reverse it? As a local example for us, in the Chesapeake Bay, a lot of watermen will use dredges to dredge for oyster. And this basically scrapes the bottom clean, removes the oysters, but then any of the other species will have a hard time thriving in that area. So it's kind of a barren wasteland in the areas that have been dragged by these dredges. So a lot of times we're shifting over to a system where people are either using tongs to individually harvest the oysters, or they'll do oyster aquaculture and farm the oysters instead of harvesting them. We also have a sanctuary reef concept where they'll set up a reef of oysters and fishermen then can't harvest there, but the excess productivity spills out to adjacent areas, and then they can harvest in those locations. So this is where the fishing activities have kind of reset the successional sequence for the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay.